Hey guys, Mickey Brueckner here with the Baseball Performance Project. Today we're discussing our off-season training protocol in video number 2. In video number 1 we discussed the importance and the structure of an early off-season training program. Today we're going to start to talk about how we're transitioning our athletes into the meat and heart of our off-season training protocol. If we go back and discuss our early off-season training, we're really focusing on cleaning up any movement patterns that are dysfunctional from our movement screens. We're talking about improving movement qualities and overall strength qualities, and then trying to stay away from all of our baseball activities and keeping things quite general in terms of our structure and exercise selection that we're giving our athletes. Now we're transitioning away from our more general and more low velocity type movements that we see in the early off season, and we're starting to transition our athletes into a little bit more high intensity in terms of strength and conditioning. We're working on more higher velocity movements. So if we relate this back to the strength velocity curve again, in the beginning part of the off season, we're focusing more on the general strength adaptations and overall movement qualities. And as we get closer to in season, we're starting to focus on a little bit more higher velocity movement patterns. Our strength patterns are focusing on higher RPEs, higher percentages, things of that nature. If we're doing any type of contrast training, any type of like accommodating strength, here would be a good time to apply that to our athletes' programs now. Another thing we're also implementing is we're starting sprinting for our athletes. Most of our position players should be sprinting at this point. Some of our pitchers, if they're here and training with us on a more frequent basis, we might do some sprinting with them. But for the most part, this would be a good time to start implementing those things. Generally, our sprinting is going to be less than 20 yards at this point, and as we get closer to the season, we're increasing that distance, all under full recovery. Some of our med ball activities are going to be a little bit lower in weight now, and we're starting to transition to higher velocity movements. This is an opportunity for us to get them prepared for throwing. We want to make sure that their rotational patterns, they're working a little bit faster, they're working a little bit more rate of force production, and this is something that's going to take them into their throwing protocol. Along with shifting our med ball work to the more higher velocity movements, we're also doing the same with our jumping and bounding and plyometrics. In the beginning part of the off season, we're focusing on just quality patterns and landing and deceleration mechanics. Now we're focusing on being a little bit more reactive, more rate of force production, be a little bit more athletic with our jumping variations and our bounding variations, which is also helping to tie into our sprinting and other med ball adaptations.
Greg Spatz here, talking about the middle of the off season. Something we want to talk about now is throwing and hitting programs, specifically throwing a little bit more than hitting, but they're both important to consider. We like to have our athletes have a plan. So whether that's a plan from a hitting or pitching coach or a strength and conditioning professional or physical therapist, no matter who it is, we just want our athletes to have a plan. Because some of the problems that we see going into the off season when kids should start to be ramping up their throwing programs is that they maybe didn't start soon enough, where now they're rushing into their mound work later into the late off season, which is just recipe for disaster as they start to build into the season. At this point in the year, our athletes tend to have about 4 to 8 weeks off from throwing, or very little or low intensity throwing. Again, depends on the athlete. If they played fall ball, if they're professional and they finished in the end of September, it really just kind of depends on the athlete. It also depends on their goals for the coming season, depends on how many innings they threw the previous season, if there were any sorts of aches or injuries during that previous season. So there's a lot of factors here, but again, in general, 48 weeks off or low intensity. And then after that, we're looking for the beginning of the throwing progression to generally start for college kids around mid to late November, high school mid to late December, and then, as I mentioned, with pro athletes, it's going to be highly variable. Climate can be another factor that can affect your throwing program. So here at the Annex, because we're in New Jersey, it's a colder climate in the winter, we're indoors. So we have a net, a cage on the turf here at the gym. The cage is about 75 feet long, so we can get up to that distance or so, but then we like to simulate the longer distances of 90 or 120 feet by either having different focuses on the net to throw into, or something at the other end of the gym to try and simulate that distance for the athlete to get that throwing distance in and intensity. Weighted balls is also a topic of conversation that we are either asked about or we see on social media or the internet. So our take on weighted balls, it really just depends on the athlete, depends on how long they've been training, again, their goals, where they currently are at, what their injury history is. But in general, we're going to start using plyo care balls pre-throwing after about 2 or 3 weeks of the general off-season throwing program. Further weighted ball throwing, again, depends highly on the athlete. It has to be for the right person at the right time with the right goal in mind. They also have to be the type of athlete that's taking their training very seriously, taking their recovery very seriously. So there's a lot of factors that are involved in implementing weighted balls, overload, underload throwing at the end of a throwing day. Some other things that might be changing at this point in the off season, we'll see some slight changes in the warm-up to account for the increase in intensity with running progressions. So whether you're a pitcher or a position player, we'll definitely start to incorporate some things like hopping, skipping, bounding into the warm-up as a way to kind of build some tissue elasticity, some tissue tolerance to set us up for later in the off-season and into the preseason. So as a position player, we're going to be a little bit more aggressive with their sprint progressions, getting them back to running at higher velocities a little bit sooner than our pitchers would be. So we might be doing that just a little bit more. Also in the warm-up, we're going to be seeing a little bit more cuff activation type exercises, just to heat up some of these tissues before throwing programs are beginning for no matter who you are, position player or pitcher. So at this point in the off-season, when training intensities are ramping up, throwing programs and hitting programs are now in full swing and building up as well, this might be a time where I, as a physical therapist, will incorporate some manual therapy with the athletes here at the Annex. It just sort of depends on what the athlete needs, and it also depends on their ability to prioritize things like recovery and corrective exercise and mobility work, right? So if I have an athlete from Mickey where they've sort of been one of the trickier athletes to make sure they maintain their mobility, I might see them more to make sure that their manual work is keeping up with their throwing program. Another thing that will change at this point in the off-season is an athlete's arm care program. So as throwing is increased and ramped up through the mid-off-season to the late off-season, we'll definitely have some sort of progressions for them in terms of their cuff work, scap work, and just maintaining a solid base for their arms to stay healthy. We hope you got a lot out of this video, the mid-off-season video. The next video will either be the arm care video or the late off-season video, just sort of depends on when we get these videos out for you. Again, if you have any questions for us, specific or general, about baseball, health and performance, the next slide that you'll see at the end here, you'll have our email addresses, and feel free to reach out with any questions or comments, or you can leave some comments down in the video comment section. Thanks.